because it's on agricultural land. I now call to order the May 17, 2017 public hearing to consider the legislative text amendment to Clackamas County Zoning and Development Ordinance to amend the county's marijuana-related land use regulations. Before we begin, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today we will continue the hearing from March 22nd, 2017 on the legislative text amendments to Clackamas County Zoning and Development Ordinance to amend the county's marijuana-related land use regulations. Today's hearing has been reserved for deliberation and decision only. On March 22nd, 2017, the board approved amendments to the county's marijuana-related land use regulations, except that it deferred a decision on whether to allow marijuana concentrates and extract process to the EFU and egg forest zoning to today's date. For the record, since marijuana is a marijuana concentrate and extract processing being considered separately, this matter has been given a new file number, now ZDO 264, for tracking purposes. Assisting us today's hearing is Clerk Kevin Moss, Senior Planner Jennifer Hughes, and Assistant County Counsel Nate Boderman. We'll now hear from the Principal Planner Jennifer Hughes.
Good morning. Just to kind of follow up on what Chair Bernard said, just administratively particularly for the benefit of the audience, we did assign this a new file number because essentially this was one package of amendments, and at your March 22nd hearing it then diverged and we went and you adopted the other related amendments, which are going to take effect on May 23rd, and deferred consideration of just this one issue. So I just want to assure the audience that the record from ZDO 263 through the hearing date of March 22nd has been incorporated into this. So all of that record is there in terms of the previous testimony. By way of background, we are here to consider changes to the county's marijuana land use regulations. As I mentioned, you held a hearing on March 22nd, 2017, and approved a set of amendments but deferred deliberation and decision on allowing marijuana concentrate and extract processing in the county's agricultural zones until today's hearing. During the hearing, the board articulated 6 issues that they wanted staff to do additional research on, and then a 7th issue was raised to the planning director subsequent to the hearing. So we have come back with a response on all of those issues. The proposal that's before you today includes legislative text amendments to the Clackamas County Zoning and Development Ordinance and would specifically amend ZDO sections 401, 407, and 841. And really there is only one key element of that proposal today, which is to allow the processing of marijuana concentrates and extracts in the EFU and ag forest zones subject to certain standards. So what this would do, as I said, is allow I should clarify. The draft that you have before you today would allow processing of marijuana concentrates in those agricultural zones. Currently, edibles and topicals may be processed. That's been permitted all along under our regulations. But we would be adding concentrates. And then the draft before you today does not permit the processing of extracts. Those would remain prohibited. However, you may wish to change that, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. What the draft would also do is continue to apply the standards of ZDO 841 to processing in these zones. So 841 has all of our marijuana land use regulations that we adopted previously that apply to marijuana production and the processing of topicals and edibles in agricultural zones. So those standards related to odor control and access and noise would continue to apply to these new processing uses as well. In addition, the proposal is to add a 100-foot minimum setback for structures used for processing in the ag forest and EFU districts. And then I should note that state law limits all agricultural processing of this type, what we kind of informally call small-scale processing, such that you can only have a maximum of a 10,000 square foot processing area and a minimum of 25% of the processed crops have to be grown on site. And that's true whether you're processing pumpkins or strawberries or marijuana. So, the processing of marijuana concentrates and extracts in the EFU and Ag Forest Zone, the BCC directed us to consider allowing both types of processing. That happened last fall at a study session. So the original proposal did include both extract and concentrate processing. In addition, the board asked us to consider a 100-foot setback, 150-foot off-site structure separation standard, a 1,000-foot buffer from residential zones, and a 20-acre minimum lot size. So the initial proposal that we notified for included all of those elements. During the review of this proposal, it became clear that there were potentially some safety concerns that exist due to the lack of building code and fire code authority over processing in agriculturally exempt buildings, despite conflicting OLCC regulations. So the state does have some standards, those are in your packet, and I've highlighted a couple of them in the staff report, that appear to require some compliance, at least to some degree, with the Oregon Structural Specialty Code and fire code. It's just unclear at this point the degree to which the state can apply those in an agriculturally exempt building. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And then the other issue that came up was whether the siting limitations as originally proposed might be redundant. In other words, is it necessary to have a setback and a minimum lot size and a structure separation and a buffer to control the location of processing facilities? And so that was discussed at the Planning Commission. And as I mentioned, then their recommendation or their proposal was to just adopt the 100-foot setback and to not adopt the other siting standards. The significant issues that were raised at the first hearing that the board articulated for staff to look into further, there were 6, and then again a 7th one that came up after the fact. So the first one related to the question of whether we should require that processing equipment have a UL listing. Staff did some research about this, and I would say that the state of the information we have right now is that it's unclear whether processing equipment could actually meet that specific standard. There are a number of different kinds of UL listings. It's possible that components of the processing equipment might be UL listed, whereas the complete system isn't. And so I did put in your staff report the state standard which gets at this issue. So the OLCC is requiring some type of certification or independent engineering analysis of equipment used for extract processing. So staff's recommendation would be that we rely on that standard rather than attempting to craft one of our own, because I think it's just a little uncertain at this point whether we would get it right, frankly, or put people in a situation where they might not be able to meet a standard that we would adopt. The second issue that was raised was this question about allowing multiple licenses, so multiple OLCC licenses on the same piece of property. And it was raised in the context of both processing and production. So currently, we do not limit the number of licenses. That was not adopted as part of our initial land use regulations for marijuana uses. You could limit the number of licenses for processing because that's part of this proposal in these agricultural zones. But we would not be able to limit the number of grow licenses per property under this action. You would need to initiate a separate amendment, and we would need to do fairly broad notice because we would be limiting what people can do currently on their property. So we would need to do a broader notice than we did initially. I will say that in terms of processing licenses, it's unlikely that we could approve more than one per property, even if we don't say that, because it appears that you're limited to only one processing facility for any type of agricultural processing. But if you want to be extra sure about that, we could certainly put a standard in that says only one. The third issue that was raised was related to a distillery that was approved near the Stone Creek Golf Course, and the question about why we couldn't regulate marijuana processing similar, because this distillery had to go through, sort of a full review with building code, fire code, and all of that. And the reason is that the zoning on that site is different. The circumstances are different. It's a rural residential zone with no farming activity going on the site, and it was a former non-conforming use for a different type of commercial use that they converted to a distillery. So, they went through the full building permit review process for that. The issue that we have here is that state law does not appear to allow us to require that type of review in an agricultural zone if someone chooses to use an agriculturally exempt structure. So that issue just didn't come up in the case of the distillery. The fourth issue was related to establishing a minimum lot size. Yes, we believe you can do that. I mean, with anything related to these marijuana land uses, it comes down to whether it's a reasonable regulation, and we've been talking about that now for a couple years, that we wish we knew exactly what that meant, but we don't. But we've established minimum lot sizes already for grow sites, and our initial proposal was to do a 20-acre minimum, so we believe, yes, you could establish a minimum lot size today if you so choose for these processing uses. Fifth issue was whether we should prohibit explosive solvents. So I admit it's been a very long time since I took chemistry, but my general understanding is that the solvents that are categorized by the state as extracts, essentially as part of the extract process, are explosive, with the apparent exception of CO2, which as far as I can tell is not explosive. But they've sorted CO2 into two different categories. They've put it in the concentrate category if you're not using pressure and you're not using high heat, which is less than 180 degrees. That's how they've defined that. If you are using high heat or pressure, you're in the extract category. So my, I think, reasonable assumption is that they put it in the two categories because they determined that it was more hazardous if you had pressure and high heat and less hazardous if you didn't. So I would say the board might consider two options. One would be just to continue, if you're concerned about this, the explosive solvents, that you would either continue to prohibit extracts and allow concentrates, or that you would allow CO2 processing under the extract category and not the others. So butane, hexane, the things that are pretty clearly volatile gases. Sixth issue was whether the county could essentially apply the fire code directly, so require compliance with the fire code, even though a building permit isn't required necessarily, and therefore the fire department wouldn't really be brought into that process. The fire code wouldn't apply to the building. Could we just simply say that it applies? To the best of my understanding, and I have two other staff people here today who know much more about this than I do, Scott Caulfield and Cheryl Bell from the Building Codes Division, we'll be happy to come up and supplement the staff report and answer your questions on these issues. But essentially, our conclusion is no, the county does not have the authority to independently apply the fire code. I also would question whether we have the appropriate staff to do that, who would be able to just go in and sort of determine that these things meet the fire code, and we certainly cannot compel the fire department to apply standards that we adopt. So. And then finally, the question that came up after the hearing in conversation with the planning director was whether we should require the use of a closed loop system for extracts. And the answer to that is that OLCC already requires that. So that is a state standard, and I think we can rely on that. Now, that does not address medical processing, but the county is much more limited in terms of what we are allowed to regulate for medical processing. And I think most of what we're really dealing with now is people wanting to get into the recreational processing market. I've really already told you what the Planning Commission recommendation is, but essentially they recommended allowing concentrate processing in the EFU and Ag Forest zones, but continuing to prohibit extract processing, to require the minimum 100-foot setback, but to not adopt the other special siting standards for processing uses. There is an existing minimum lot size that would apply, 2 or 5 acres, depending on the type of grow site. So it's a 2-acre for an indoor grow, 5-acre for an outdoor grow. That would carry through and apply to processing regardless of whether if you choose not to adopt a special standard today. And the draft amendments that you have in your packets reflect the changes that the Planning Commission made during their deliberations. And staff's recommendation is approval of ZDO 264 as recommended by the Planning Commission. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions regarding agriculturally exempt structures, building code requirements, what we permit and don't permit, how the fire code interfaces with that, I have 2 experts in the room that would be just thrilled to come talk to you.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So how many concentrate processors are currently out there? Are there none?
I do not have a number. In terms of what the county would have permitted, there's 2 possibilities. There's some medical processing that's just allowed through Oregon Health Authority that we never actually see. So I can't say there's not stuff out there we don't know about. But in terms of what we would have approved, they would have been all in industrial districts. And we have had some, I don't actually know whether they're concentrates versus extracts, but we have some in the industrial zones.
The reason I ask is this regulation, we wouldn't be there wouldn't be some that were already grandfathered once we change the regulation, as far as we know, except maybe in the
Right.
medical.
As far as we know, so the ones that are in the industrial zones, there are no special standard. We didn't adopt special standards for the most part. There's a square footage limit for processing in industrial districts because there are a number of other, hazardous processing activities going on in those zones, and we've just sort of treated it the same way. So they don't have standards that would be affected by what you're doing today. And so no, there's nothing we've approved as far as recreational concentrate and extract processing in agricultural zones that would be grandfathered by this.
Okay, then one other thing, we don't. Does OLCC or does the county have the ability to go in and inspect to see that they're using UL listed equipment? We don't, do we?
Thank you.
Well, so OLCC has administrative rules that cover a number of things. And I would assume, I'm going to kind of look at Nate here, that under their licensing authority, they would be able to inspect for compliance with those standards?
For compliance with the standards specifically, yeah. And we don't have any, well, I mean, I guess that's what part of this hearing's about, but we don't have any companion standards, so we couldn't today go in and inspect any of the equipment now without having any standards to enforce.
So then if we did say they had to be UL listed equipment, that would create a standard which would allow us to inspect.
That's correct.
Okay.
I do. Let me just follow up a little bit, too, to let you know that we reached out to OLCC actually twice. The first time we did not get a response. The second time we did, trying to understand how they were addressing these issues with fire department approval and building code compliance on these extract processors. And the response that we received was, we're in agriculturally exempt buildings, that issue. And they said, we're aware of the question, but we're essentially not prepared to answer at this point. We need to meet further and we will get back to you. So I think they understand there's an issue that needs to be resolved.
Okay. Sonia?
No, me.
Oh, you didn't.
I understand, yeah, that's me.
I usually am there.
I understand that lavender is processed in a similar way to concentrate and extract. Is that correct?
I have been told that. I don't have any independent knowledge of how lavender is processed. It's possible, I know we have the lavender farm that happened, and it's possible that Scott Caulfield may actually know more about that because I know he was very involved in permitting that building. I don't know the exact process, but I have been told that other oils that you're extracting, so be it canola oil, be it lavender oil, mint oil, excuse me, that they do use similar processes. What I don't know is whether the solvents are the same. So they're using something to extract the oil, but whether it's butane, hexane, CO2, water, that I don't know.
Okay.
Scott, do you know more? Why don't you go ahead and come on up? Please.
Sorry.
I'm not seeing a light. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, Chair Bernard, Commissioners. My name is Scott Caulfield. I'm the Building Codes Administrator for the county. And as Ms. Hughes pointed out, I am thrilled to be here to speak to you today on this topic. So to answer your specific question, lavender, mint, any of the botanicals and those kinds of things, that can be obtained through a distillation process would be derived in the same way that marijuana would be derived. And to the question about the specific chemicals that would be used, certainly some of the same chemicals would be used. My understanding is there's also alcohol distillation and those kinds of things. So I think it's a function of the equipment used, the end product, and all of those things come into play.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions of Scott?
So do you know specifically are things such as butane, propane, and hexane being used to extract high concentrates from any agricultural products in the ag zones?
I do know that butane is used. I don't know about hexane or the other products. I do know that alcohol is used. It's alcohol is sort of used to concentrate the oil to collect, and then it's sort of evaporated off of the product. But beyond that, no, I don't know.
Do you have any idea how many facilities we have in the county doing that?
I'm aware specifically of 2, but I don't know beyond that, Commissioner. And
are you aware of fire codes of any kind that are being enforced in this process in any of these locations?
In the 2 that I'm aware of, they're agriculturally zoned. In other words, they're not in the urban area, so so they would, to my mind, be classified as agricultural exempt. And I would say no, unfortunately, based on my analysis and conversations we've had with the fire districts, and also my understanding of both the state law and the building code itself, there isn't much of a way of a path to incorporate fire code regulation. The only path that would get us there would be if, in fact, the building code specifically referenced a section of the fire code. In other words, if it said, to satisfy this particular code requirement, you need to do A and B and C, and also this portion of the fire code, then we would have authority to get there. The issue, though, the broader issue is that because of ORS 455-315, which essentially exempts agricultural buildings, I can't get to the building code in the first place to then, get to a fire code provision. So the path just simply isn't there.
Do you know if whether or not they're using what's known as a closed loop system in the current facilities that are processing extracts?
I do not know that. I'm not familiar with the, with the specific operation that they have, so.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So they do still have to go through electrical and plumbing inspections.
That's correct. So, so ORS 455-315 exempts the building only from meeting the requirements of what we call the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, which is the adopted building code in Oregon. It does not exempt the building from electrical, plumbing, mechanical, those kinds of codes, what we typically refer to as sort of the trade permits. So those apply, they always apply. The thing I would add, though, is that while, for example, the electrical code is designed to ensure that the electrical wiring, the electrical service in the building is safe and, and appropriate for the use at hand, it doesn't extend beyond that. There isn't anything that really speaks to broader issues related, say, to the building safety and that kind of thing. And said another way, they're very limited in terms of what they regulate.
Okay. Any other questions of Scott?
No.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions?
Not right now.
All right.
Later.
Okay, so let's go ahead and have some, talk about what we want to do here. Who wants to start?
Well, what I've been wrestling with, Mr. Chairman, is how we balance out 2 issues. One is the community's concern for the safety issue, which I don't think is an illegitimate concern at all. I think it is a legitimate concern, given the fact that the fire department can't be involved in inspections and that sort of thing. And I get that creates a problem. And I wrestle with that against the equity issue of treating what's considered to be an agricultural product by the voters in the state in a fair manner, the same as lavender or mint or any of the rest of them. That's been the wrestling match that I've been dealing with. And then I think it's probably the case that until such time as the fire issue is resolved, that extract processing is probably problematic at this point. But that concentrate, which doesn't require the use of explosives, is probably doable. I would propose that if we go this route, that the lot size be a 10-acre lot size. I would propose, as is recommended by staff, that we not allow multiple licenses per property. That tends to make it difficult to deal with who's doing what wrong when you have multiple licensees on a property. And therefore more difficult to hold somebody accountable for not doing things the way they're supposed to do it. And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Go ahead.
So I think that I echo line for line all of your concerns. I'm a big supporter of this growing industry. I think it has huge potential to provide economic activity, and I appreciate the medicinal values of marijuana. I think there's huge value, but I'm very concerned about the conflicting regulations. And while I also see the issue of treating different agricultural products differently, I also recognize that lavender and mint are not regulated by the OLCC, and marijuana is regulated by the OLCC, so I do see them as very different. I get very concerned about our fire marshal not being able to do what it can do in industrial areas where extracts are being processed until we get to a time when we can treat both what happens in an industrial use similarly to what happens in agricultural use until the state figures out what it's going to do. I think holding off is probably wise. But I do think that we as a county who is interested in making sure that this industry grows in a way that is good for everyone, including residents, including the industry, that we possibly become more actively involved with advocating at the state level and working with OLCC and possibly with our legislative delegation. I'm not sure where the fix is, but I think that we should be actively involved so that we don't have that conflict. Commissioner Humberston, that you said about treating different agricultural uses differently, that we get to a place where it's safe for everyone.
Okay. So I think one thing that I disagree with is that the voters didn't vote that this be treated the same as all agricultural products. I don't think it ever.
I'll stand corrected on that.
The legislature or interpreted it a different way in many, many ways. And the issue with the fire, I know that OLCC is looking at what they might be able to do with inspections for potential fire hazards, or that maybe figure out how we can get the fire districts or fire marshals in to inspect. I hope they are, at least, but I understand there is some discussion. So I'm leaning to increasing the acreage to 10 lot minimums, 100-foot setback, which is already true, and going with concentrates and reserving extracts for maybe another ZDO number, 265 maybe. But because we don't even have any money yet to inspect these places or to enforce these places, I definitely think that the concentrate issue should be, the extract issue should be wait and see what happens with the legislature and OLCC, how they clear this up. But it sounds like we're 10-acre minimum.
Yes.
Concentrates only, minimum we already said that. What was the other one?
We already have a 100-foot setback.
Yeah.
And concentrates.
Concentrates
And
only.
not extracts.
Yep. So.
I have a question before we put a motion on the floor. Can concentrate, and there may be somebody in the room that can answer this question. I know concentrates can be done with CO2 without pressure.
Correct.
Are they also done with explosives or not?
It's like water, vegetable oil, glycerin.
But not with
But not the
propane,
volatile gases,
butane,
correct.
none of the
That's correct.
explosives?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. do we need to include language that specifically prohibits the use of those explosives in a proposed ordinance at this time?
No, based on the OLCC administrative rules, just by simply using the definition that we have. We already have a definition of concentrates, and that's sufficient.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted
No,
to make sure
that's
that,
Great question.
I mean, the community's biggest concern is, as I read the letters and everything that we received, has been the safety issue. And that resonates. And if we don't have the ability to inspect the interior UL listed equipment and the fire safety aspects of things, then that does create a potential problem. So I just wanted to be sure we covered the base.
Yes.
All right.
So this is probably what it is. We're changing that. We're adding 10-acre lot size.
Okay, so the form of the motion would be to allow the processing of concentrates in marijuana and EFU and agricultural forest land and with a minimum acreage size of 10. And the 100-foot setback's already in there, so we don't need to worry about that. And that sounds like the motion. Anything else?
Yeah, I would suggest that you would reference back to the staff recommendation. So look to suggested motion number 2.
I just wanted to make sure exactly what the staff recommendation
Where
is.
is it in here?
Where is it in this?
So page 2, bottom of the page.
Are we looking at the, this?
Oh.
I'm
Of the
sorry,
script.
the script that's been provided for you.
All right, so. Oh, well, you're talking about the form of the motion.
Correct.
So what we're talking about is exactly the staff's recommendation.
With 2 changes, 10-acre minimum and no multiple processing,
Okay,
only one
that's-
processing license per lot of record.
Yes.
So make a motion.
I want to make sure, is UL listed equipment in the proposal?
It's only in the OLCC rules. If you wanted us to incorporate the OLCC regulation into the zoning ordinance, that would need to be part of your motion, but it does exist at the state level.
I think that would be a wise decision, frankly.
What's the pros and what's the why?
That means the equipment has been certified by Underwriters Laboratories, so it's not just some haphazard Tennessee mountain whiskey still approach.
Okay,
type
so
of thing.
let me just make sure I
To be-
understand this. So currently, OLCC has a regulation.
Yes.
If we also adopt that regulation, I'm assuming that gives us the authority to regulate, but do we have the capacity to do that? Or practically, what effect would that have?
If we ever get any money, we might.
I don't know if we have the expertise to know. It would be a condition.
Yeah, I think the difficulty would come in enforcing the regulation, of course. This is OLCC standard that we would be incorporating, so we would need to take a look at whether we have anybody in-house that would have that expertise. To your question more specifically, what's the consequence of violating that standard? It would be in our zoning ordinance, and so if they don't comply with that particular regulation, we would open a code enforcement complaint against that particular operation.
Okay.
And just to clarify, the OLCC standard allows them to, it's built to codes of recognized and generally accepted good engineering standards, such as those of American National Standards Institute, Underwriters Laboratories, or the American Society for Testing and Materials. So it's not just there's several certification agencies, or it sounds to me like they could, bring in their own sort of engineering certification to demonstrate. So there's more than one way to meet the state standard.
Is it
Is-
common, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is there a downside to including it?
Is there an upside to including
Well,
it?
again, I mean, we sometimes hesitate, at least as staff, to recommend that we adopt anything that we can't realistically enforce. What I can't tell you is whether we can or can't enforce it right now. I just don't know if we have that expertise, or if OLCC would be a good partner in helping us determine whether those are meeting that particular standard.
And actually, just to clarify, I think maybe, so the state standard only applies to the extract processing equipment, so we're really not going in that direction. If your motion is going to be just concentrates, none of this really seems to get at this issue of these closed loop extraction systems for the extract processors, as opposed to concentrates. And I'm not honestly sure exactly, there's not a lot of discussion in here on what type of equipment is used for concentrates.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chairman, I would move to approve ZDO 264 as recommended by staff with the following changes, that we have a 10-acre minimum. I think that was, and there was,
No multiple licenses.
and thank you, and no multiple licenses on any given property,
And concentrates only.
and concentrates only.
And I just have one question about the multiple licenses. Is that recommended in the sense that it will streamline the process? Is there any are those licensing different things that are important?
No, so it would just mean you could only have one processor on a given property. You couldn't have 3 or 4 or 5 different marijuana processors located on the same piece
Okay,
of ground.
I
So it
understand.
limits the
Thank you.
scope.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion?
I just want to thank our staff for helping me understand this issue. Thank you very much.
I'd like staff to prepare for the potential future that standards like UL standards for the equipment that are enforceable with consequences, that once the state resolves the fire code issue for us, that those standards are prepared in advance so that, because I'm sure this will come before us again on the extract basis, and if we're going to go down that road, I want to make sure every base is covered in advance as safely as possible. We might as well be ahead of the curve on that, because I definitely see this coming back at us.
The one thing I after reading the letters from the fire districts, fire marshals and folks, it really says that the fire district doesn't have any ability to inspect for fires on ag land. I mean, inspect for safety on ag land. The question is, what if we contracted somebody to inspect for fire hazards, and we made that part of our code?
So it's my understanding, and Scott can jump up and yell at me if I'm saying the wrong thing, that field is sort of occupied, that we really can't insert ourselves even by calling it something else, that we would be essentially applying our own fire code in lieu of the state fire marshal's authority, and I think that we can't do that.
Yeah, he was nodding.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
They essentially have preempted all authority in that arena.
That is my understanding, yes.
All right, any further discussion? So I'm going to try to restate the motion. It's been moved and seconded to approve ZDO 264 as recommended by staff with the addition of 10-acre minimum, no multiple licenses, and concentrates only. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Let me see if I have to read anything else. Okay, now that the amendment has been approved, I'll direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting today's decision and include it on an agenda for a board adoption at a future business meeting. That means there's an opportunity to comment again. No?
Well,
No.
typically not. So when we adopt land use ordinances, those are staff report and
Okay.
board
All right.
adoption, yeah.
All right, with that, we'll close the hearing on ZDO 264.
Well, good, you can hear it.